I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, The Disconnect. Buyers are from Mars and vendors are from Venus. My name is Arlene Itori and I'm a webinar coordinator for the Outsourcing Institute. And it is our pleasure to be the co-host of today's event with Blue Hill Data Services. I'll be working in the background to help answer any technical or general questions that you may have. We encourage you at any time during the presentation to submit your questions to today's speakers. To do this, click on the questions box, type your question in the space provided, and click on the Submit button. Today's webinar is being recorded. You will be receiving a follow-up email in approximately 2 days, which will include a link with today's recorded webinar and presentation slides. The webinar recording and the presentation slides will also be available at outsourcing.com. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to our moderator, Frank Casal, founder and CEO of the Outsourcing Institute, for the formal introduction of today's speakers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Arlene. Welcome, everyone, to today's session. This promises to be informative, and there may be even a little bit of infotainment if this plays out the way it did at our last roadshow. I was fortunate to be moderating this very same topic, this panel, if you will, with the focus really being on this ongoing disconnect that many of you are challenged with between outsourcing buyers and providers. This is by no means limited to the outsourcing space, but I would say it's possibly exacerbated by the complexities of outsourcing. And if I think back to the challenges that our members face over the years, so we started OI in 1993. Things have changed a lot since then, but I can tell you with 100% confidence that one issue that was around then and is still around now is the governance and or relationship management challenge. So that's what we'll be focusing on today. I can tell even by the turnout today, it was a good turnout for this webinar, and it really spans all industries and all size companies. So that's further proof that this is ongoing. What I'd like to do, similar to what we did kind of in person at the roadshow, is allow each of my moderators, each of my panelists here to just briefly introduce themselves. And if you can do so in a minute each, take a minute each of you to do that, and then we can just kind of dive in. John, can I start with you?
Sure. I'm John Lawley, the Chief Operating Officer of Blue Hill Data Services. Blue Hill is a mid-tier infrastructure services provider, data center outsourcing, managed hosting provider, if you will, multi-platform, providing 7x24 data center hosting services to global customers. We are 100%, we deliver all services onshore, from onshore, facilities, staffing, and so forth. Our network reach is 22 time zones around the country, around the world, around the globe, and everyone's customers today are global, whether it's sales offices or manufacturing plants overseas or what have you.
Great. Thanks, John. Peter?
I'm Peter Messina, Chief Operating Officer of CAPS, Computer Alternative Processing Sites, and I'm a sister company of the Blue Hill Data Services. We're located here in Connecticut. We have 2 data centers. We've been around since 1995, specifically in the DR, business continuity world, and the co-location. We have full 7x24 managed services, and we're always looking to expand. Thank you.
Okay, Vishal, if you can please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Frank. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, wherever the people have logged in. And thanks, Frank and OI, for giving me another opportunity to share my views on this interesting topic. Presently, I head the Wealth Management Operations Offshoring Initiative for UBS. And prior to that, I was with Credit Suisse. So in my job, I interact with the strategic needs of my company and in the engagement of vendors, both in the change the bank and run the bank portfolio. So looking forward for the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Vishal. Last but certainly not least, Mr. Joe Rosenthal.
Thanks, Frank. Hello, everybody. I was just thinking that I've been at the outsourcing game probably for about 15 years, mostly in telecommunications and financial services. And yeah, we do seem to be hitting the same bumps in the road. So glad for the opportunity to participate in this panel.
Sounds great. Thank you all. So what we have here is two providers and two practitioners, if you will. So we tried to balance this out. And the way we have this structured is I will have a question, if you will, and then we'll address this with all sides of the equation. But before we dive in, Arlene is reminding me here to give my quick OI commercial. I believe probably 3/4 of you know OI, you are members. But for those of you who don't, or maybe are not familiar with all the things we do, we have an extremely large network of outsourcing professionals representing buyers, providers, and influencers. Folks typically come to us by dialing outsourcing into Google, and they're looking for trends, best practices, case studies, things along those lines. We also provide, so in addition to that content, which is for the most part free, to members, and membership is free, so you just need to opt in. That's probably how you got here. We also have a suite of service offerings. We do training. We have matchmaking services. We do sponsorship and demand generation for the providers. We have a sister company, CMS, which does recruiting specifically for ITO, BPO. And we have a whole host of events that we tend to do. And I have two that I made note of talking about specifically. Oh, Arlene, you beat me to it. Okay, so we have the December Roadshow, which is exactly on this topic. So if you care about governance and relationship management and you want to hear from the best and brightest, New York, December 5th, that is our roadshow format that many of you are familiar with. We're doing a first-time event in March in New York as well, Wall Street Tech Conference. The difference there is we're focusing specifically from an audience perspective in the BFSI space. The other difference is from a content perspective, we're actually expanding significantly beyond outsourcing. The theme is T5, which are 5 technology-related trends, creating opportunities and challenges for the Wall Street firms. So that the T5 includes outsourcing, cloud, big data, mobility, security, and compliance. So if you're interested, we'd love to see you there. There's information at outsourcing.com, and you could always just drop us an email. There'll be 1 or 2 emails posted on this PowerPoint. Excuse me. Okay, so here's the first question. The greatest challenge, and here's really kind of a statement, if you will. The greatest challenge and the greatest risk for many outsourcing buyers and providers is this perpetual gap. So think of it this way, folks. Many of you, both buy side and sell side, spend a significant amount of time on the front end focusing on really price, deliverables, KPIs, things of that sort on the front end. And where we see time and time again is, many of these deals struggling, if not falling apart on the back end, really based on other factors. And we'll talk about them here today. But I think we have the question, if you will. One of the questions is the next slide. So Vishal, I'll start with you. Why do you think, why at this point, I mean, many would say this is a fairly mature space, right? People like Joe Rosenthal doing this for 15 years, for heaven's sake. But why are we all, even, the seasoned people, still struggling with this perpetual disconnect? What's your opinion, Vishal?
So, Frank, it's a good question. Like any other industry, when the offshoring started way back at GE in the 80s, it took, another spectrum. In the 90s, we saw another boom where smaller and larger companies started, doing the application development. It led into the BPO and the KPO and the infrastructure space. So the maturity, came about both at the buy side as well as the sell side. But the disconnect is still there because as much as, I look at IT as a continuous engagement of your work portfolio, which a vendor does. And for the BPU and KPU, it is a ditto image of a carbon copy of the work you do. So the disconnect is more in the BPU and the KPU space until unless a proper transition and a proper understanding of the domain is there. And I have been on the buy side, on the sell side also, way back in 2002, 2003, and I understand when I used to go and meet buyers, how they used to react to a certain proposition. I used to think, I make sense. Why do not they understand? But now, since 2006, sitting at the buy side, I understand what the difference here, the challenges, the aspiration, and the strategic initiative. What lead us to go into a offshoring or a strategic initiative are very different. From a sell side, it is more, getting business, right? How do you get business? How do you sustain it? How do you grow it? From a buy side, it is giving business, but giving business doesn't mean giving business. Giving business means how does business is given, and you are de-risking your assets, your initiatives, your approach to the vendor, and the vendor should be up to speed to take that quantum of work. One is that, and secondly, what I have seen, I think as this, and I'm in the financial industry, as this market is growing up, as there is a continuous competitive environment as well as a change in the marketplace. Things are changing, the products and the services. Every day there is a new innovation, new technology which is coming up, making it more harder as well as competitive to sell at the marketplace. And I think all this, India, China, Brazil, Philippines, all this have become big hubs of offshoring and becoming a second conduit of line for operations. So it's very important for those guys to think alike and strategize their thinking along with the buy side. But the good news is, as we are progressing and initiative like Captain's Table initiative, like a stakeholder mapping where senior management from both sides meet and they look at avenues how they can work together as a single utility and work towards gaining a momentum and then letting it go as a shared services to different banks or different organizations. So I think that disconnect will remain. You cannot, I cannot enter your house and Frank and see how you live unless I live in that house, right? So no blame to the vendor side and no kudos to the buy side. That disconnect will remain, but that will only change with the time. And I think the more engagement, the more transparency, and the more trust buyers and sellers will have, that will improve this relationship.
So thank you, Vishal. John, what do you think? I mean, Vishal came from, at one point in his career, he was on the sell side. Now he's on the buy side, right? You kind of the other way around, right, John? You came from the buy side. Now you're on the sell side. So you similarly do know both sides, but yet you're still seeing that disconnect. Why do you think it's still there?
Well, you're right, Frank. I'm the former CIO of CBS, the broadcasting company, and spent a good part of my career on the buy side, and at the same time having spent a good part of my career on the sell side as well, getting into the outsourcing, industry, as we call it, and primarily speaking from the infrastructure services side. You both hit on two real critical data points in terms of disconnect between the buyers and the providers. Frank, you mentioned the time spent up front on getting the deal in the first place, on the price, and on the KPI, the SLAs and so forth. A lot of that is done. But what I've seen is that at the same time up front, not enough upfront time is spent on, what I call the handshake. How do we do business together? On the front end, establishing a process, a mechanism, which all really boils down to communications. How do we communicate together? It's not just about the data, the minute-to-minute communications on the support, from the support desk or help desk side, or about the relationship manager and the governance meetings, but also the executive level meetings to confirm that both the buyer and the seller are on the same, are in the same direction, if you will. Their strategy is going the same way, and a mechanism to confirm that, validate that, and be open to change for that. Because, as Vishal pointed out, The major disconnect is the expectation of the buyer. In other words, the buyer thinks, in part, that they are signing up, for certain services, and the provider thinks certain services may not be their responsibility. That is what where I've seen this happen, where I've seen the disconnect. That is the area that that is most prevalent. We head that off by spending more time up front, with the handshake, how we do business together, and then on a more detailed level, on being very, very clear about laying out what we call a responsibility matrix, where we outline together who is responsible for what functions. And that is just so important. And when you do that, that's the good news part of it. That's how you avoid that disconnect between buyer expectations and provider assumptions.
Okay. No, thanks. Peter, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I was on both sides, too, myself in my career. And I could add to that assumptions are made, and it's not clearly defined. So the scope of the project has to be laid out very clearly so both sides truly know what the expectation level is. And another key point, what both gentlemen here said is very, very true. But also I find that sometimes people are talking at each other rather than listening. So the point never gets really across, and then naturally things start falling through the cracks. That's my finding.
Okay. That's fair enough. Fair enough. All righty, Arlene, let's jump to the next slide. So what impact does this disconnect typically have on the outcome of the effort? So Joe Rosenthal, as I think about relationships that you've been involved in, I'm sure some of them are functional, some of them are dysfunctional. There's a bunch in the middle. Where you have some that start to shift toward the dysfunctional side. What is the result? So what is the impact as you see it from the client side by not having that better relationship?
Well, it's interesting because, in listening to the gentleman who was speaking earlier, it's that concept of sides. And I think one driver for the problems that you continue to have on these deals is this strange idea about making a profit, on the sell side and controlling expenses, on the buy side. So what's the typical impact? Even if you can spend millions of dollars structuring a deal, and if you're, let's say on the infrastructure side, outsourcing your mainframe environment, probably because of the fact that we maybe, on the buy side, pressed the seller too hard, we were then questioned about work, in the mainframe space, and that, that goes back a bit. But I see, that sort of problem cropping up, and that even if you do structure a contract well with governance and responsibility matrices, that you oftentimes because of the need to get the work done, your internal clients are shaking hands, if you will, for additional work, and then it'll come back to the people responsible for the contract to actually resolve issues that come about because you're not even following that contract guideline that you spent a fortune and an awful lot of time structuring.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's just it's a problem on both sides, really, in terms of how you manage things going forward. And yes, you can mitigate some of the risk of problems occurring by having communications and governance and raising the issues and getting sourcing involved or the organization that's responsible for the deal to support resolution and bring people back to the contract.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Vishal, are we talking about things like, just specifically things like missed deadlines? Are we talking about cost? costs not being where you expected them to be, or quality, or what, if you could point to, if you were advising somebody new to the space and said, here's why you want to have all your stuff together here with this relationship. If not, here, here's the potential outcome and how this could come to bite you where you don't want it to. What are some of the scenarios that you've experienced or you've observed?
Yeah, so two things, Frank. One, if there is an existing work being performed on an annuitized basis by a vendor. So when a service provider comes in, there's a shake hand on trust and transparency, and the deal is struck, right? Two things can happen. One, there are changes at the buy side, which forces the vendor to realign his strategy for that particular initiative. Or second is, it remains status quo. In cases it remains status quo, where the vendor has already targeted X amount of productivity coming back, either they give it upfront or annuitized basis for 2.5, 5, or whatever year the contract is signed. I was speaking to one of a very senior, person from one of the tier 1 vendors, and I told him, I haven't seen any service provider coming to my office and telling, we are doing this productivity gain for this assignment. We can do something else. We talk about innovation, we talk about governance, we talk about all those things. But I think still, including me, we have not reached at that level where we can think beyond this. And I'm still struggling to find answers for that myself, where we can think beyond this and look at areas where more than productivity, more than cost saves, what else we can get for offshoring. In the times to come, Frank and others who are on the call, I think offshoring as of now also, it is no longer that the work is performed in India or China or Brazil or wherever it is. It is more a convoluted or extended team. But to reap more benefits out of the team, everybody, including the buyers and the system integrators, we have to think alike. So one is that. The second scenario is when there is a new opportunity, when the buyer is at the smarter side and he's trying to find better options, and these options could be based on internal matrix, based on cost, based on location and other things. I think that's the time the buyer should come up with some innovative ideas and work with the vendor and internal stakeholders to devise a deal which will reflect quantum productivity as the deal grows through. So I think it is more said than done. I have done it. That's why I'm talking about this. But I think as we see more deals in infrastructure or application or operations, and now we are talking of annuitized deals which combines all three together, I think those are the deals which make more sense, where you see more productivity gain for alignment of IT as well as operations as well as infrastructure.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please, Arlene. Okay, so let's talk about what are the most common symptoms of a somewhat dysfunctional relationship. So, so here's a quick story. So my wife's reading Cosmo magazine a couple of years ago. Arlene, are you still on the line? And it asked her, it was like a relationship quiz, and then I suddenly ended up in trouble because based on that quiz, I guess, I just suddenly ended up in trouble. But so if you think about it, from the standpoint of outsourcing relationship scenario, there's nobody that's doing a diagnostic. There's no Cosmo quiz where somebody says, well, I thought everything was okay, but now after going down this quiz, gee, we could be doing so much better. So I'll start with you, John. You've seen many different deals over the years. What are the symptoms that if you can say yes to one or more of these, you may have some sort of a dysfunctional relationship?
Well, again, it's no communication, dead silence. When you're going along in a relationship and there's basically little or no communications, that's a harbinger, for problems. And when you start, you never want to pull the contract out of the drawer. When that starts happening, when you're dwelling on any communications, dwelling on SLA discrepancies, or talking about service levels or billing discrepancies, that, referring to the contract, when you start seeing things like that, that's an automatic symptom. And essentially in terms of the what's wrong and what, like, for example, your normal communications, I mean, outside of your minute-to-minute, as I referred to it, communication line, that's your help desk, right? But the governance meetings, you're relying on a quarterly meeting or what have you. We have, even ourselves, we have some things are going so well, you think are going so well that meetings are canceled all the time. They're being canceled by the customer, by the buyer. Later on, time goes on down the line, a problem comes up. Why haven't we talked about this, right? So you can't have that gap, where you think it's for good reasons or bad reasons. You can't have that gap with no communications. We have a couple of customers recently that have canceled account management meetings because things have been going so well, weekly, monthly, even quarterly, for months. Now, the way you get around that is you don't let that happen. Okay, you cancel those meetings. You don't need to have those discussions necessarily, but as someone pointed out, the relationship manager. There's nothing that prevents the relationship manager from calling his contact on an unscheduled basis. Last night, I noticed your batch stream ran faster or got done earlier, or that add-in that we were having a problem with, we've taken control of it, and it's not happening again, just to maintain some communication level. So it always comes down to communication because, whether it's an outsourcing provider, whether it's on the infrastructure side or the application side, number one, should never make promises that they can't deliver. And that's a harbinger for problems right from the get-go. So don't make promises that can't be kept. And as far as innovation, as Vishal points out, I see it as from the provider side, the seller side, as flexibility. In other words, those forget the contract documents, the responsibilities matrix. That's not really a contract. I mean, what it is it's kind of a schedule of the job functions that you're supposed to be delivering. Well, that's a working document. Things change, and say a third shift person on the buyer side on their help desk, they lose that person. And they call it, we don't have anybody, on our side. Okay, it may be some expanded scope for the seller, for the provider, but the provider has to be reasonable and flexible and work with the customer in connection with providing a service that may not have initially been in scope, but business things change, and not take advantage of it. We do several add-on functions many times as a pass-through. I mean, we're certainly not going to lose money on it, but sometimes we will do it as a pass-through because it helps both sides. It helps us deliver the services better, and it does something for the customer. So the solution to the symptoms, and the symptoms can be anything. As I mentioned, dwelling on things you're not supposed to be dwelling on, like SLAs and billing and so forth. The solution is to be flexible, and out of flexibility comes innovation. Where you can help, you may not be aware of helping. Something comes up that's business change. You respond to it in a collaborative way, and not in a way, just because of the dollars and cents, approach.
Okay, thank you, John.
In line with that, the point about innovation, what's a symptom? You're a year into an infrastructure outsourcing deal, and the supplier has performed well, but then the client is saying, well, where's the innovation? But again, where was that collaboration, over the course of the year? What were they looking at together in terms of possible opportunities to innovate?
Okay, John.
That might not have been spelled out. Might not have been spelled out in the contract agreement.
Right. I agree with that, 100%.
Well, I want to come back to innovation in a bit, Joe, but it's a good point that you bring up, not only about innovation, but about things that are not spelled out early on. So, Arlene, I think you're good. Yes, go ahead, buddy.
This is Peter. I just want to interject. Basically, we've all heard in the real estate industry, it's location, location, location. In our business, communication, communication, communication. You have to be upfront and make sure that everything is communicated correctly. And if things start getting off of the track, basically you got to look at this not as a vendor, but as a partner. You want to make sure that both of us into this project to make sure that we both win and we're successful. So I just wanted to hop on the communication, but that's
it's a fair point. Fair point. Okay, so here's where I start trouble, John, a little bit. So whose fault is it here?
This is where you start trouble. This is John.
This is where, but let me make it a little bit easier. Okay, so I've obviously, so as the guy who heads up OI here, we have over 70,000 members. I see all sides. I've been invited to many closed-door sessions, and so I have my opinion. I guess I'll save my opinion for last. So, Vishal, let me circle back to you here, and I know you have to change from one phone to the other. I'm not sure if you've done that yet, but if you're still there, having been on the buy side and the sell side, Vishal, who do you think is really most at fault here? Is it the provider? Are they kind of just not paying attention or misleading? Is it the practitioner? Just tough to please, moving target? How do you vote?
I think he's changing. I think he's gone.
Yeah.
I think he mentioned he was shifting locations.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll get back to. So, John, back to you. Sorry, you're on the hot seat, John. What do you honestly think?
Let me take a shot at it, and certainly this is a sensitive subject, and like I said, I've been probably 50-50 on both sides of the equation, right, in my career, and the politically correct answer for me to say, as heading up an infrastructure services outsourcing provider that supports all platforms, mainframe, mid-range, iSeries, open systems, right? The politically correct answer would be to say the provider, and there's many reasons the provider could be at fault, not delivering what they promised, not paying attention, as you say, or what have you, okay? But the answer, my answer, is that is the buyer, the client. And I've seen this. We see this all the time because there's no provider. We're not a tier one, we're a mid-tier, but the tier ones, the IBMs of the world, the EDSs, HPs, the ACSs, or what have you, they would all respond to delivering a services. It's rarely a technical, a service-related kind of an issue. I say the customer for the following reasons, and here's what I say. Low or practically no knowledge base on their end. They moved on. When they do the deal, whatever they're outsourcing, they moved on. There's a lack of knowledge of their own systems. And that translates to taking advantage of their decision to outsource. It's not everybody now. I've seen this, sporadically. Taking the short-term advantage. We had an example. Here's two examples. One example, an outsourcing deal was consummated. On the first day of production, after the successful migration, on the first day, the buyer, the customer, fired the entire staff that was supporting that outsourced function without any discussion or coordination with the provider they just signed a contract with, but they went ahead and took advantage of a financial issue they must have had without any planning for knowledge transfer. So that, of course, that's kind of obvious as to what the ramifications of that could be. Another example is a provider who has waited so long that they're down to the last man standing in certain critical areas of expertise and are in a rush to get it outsourced. And essentially, in those instances, what I've seen is that there are customers out there, and I put this in quotes, that simply waited too long to outsource the pain level they have, whether it's legacy system because they need to focus on something else, or whether it's staffing issues, or whether it's financial issues, waited too long. We see many times customers coming in, and you look at this thing, and you can see through the migration process. And we have a customer we're in the process of migrating right now, right this minute, for example, that has asked us, the provider, to do a proof of concept for them, which is unheard of in this industry. Normally, the proof of concept is conducted by the customer, by the buyer, not by the provider. And that's how long they waited. They have basically no, they're on the last string, and obviously the migration and the support time has to be done correctly, because we are talking about mission critical applications. So basically, that's the way I see it. The provider, the provider, you can point fingers all you want at different, but you can put action plans together unless they totally ignore them. Most providers, if you're in this business, you know how to deliver the services. You're technically adept, and so forth. So, that's how I see who is typically more when that happens, in those instances.
So Joe Rosenthal, just quickly if you can, because I want to make sure we get through the slides, and there's a handful of really good questions that I want to get to that the attendees are sending in, and I encourage you all, again, as if you're here listening, you have a thought or a question or an answer even to one of these questions, please send it my way. Make sure I get through all of them. These questions we have here on the slides are really just more to stimulate the discussion. Your questions are more important than mine. So, Joe, let me allow you to respond. So, I've seen plenty of scenarios where buyers are ill-prepared, or, as John mentioned, leave it to the last minute, or they kind of, initially they seem to be buying one thing, and, all of a sudden, kind of changes, right? They're expecting something else down the line, and creates some stress and some resource and or commercial stress for the provider. But I've seen those deals, and I agree with that. But let's look at the other scenario. If you think of a scenario where the provider was at fault, and I'm sure you've experienced a couple of those. What does that look like, and how does that play out?
Well, first of all of the providers that I've dealt with have been perfect. But actually, look, it's the enemy is us. I think early on, going back to what John was saying, sure, it seemed like such a great idea. Wow, we can save all these expenses. Let's get rid of an entire group supporting a particular application or an environment. So you learn from those mistakes on the buy side. But then on the sell side, I still see a situation where they're essentially buying the business, and before you know it, you're fighting the battle of change control. So it's tough, especially if it's a competitive event, to just for the provider to just play it as straight as you can, so it's not a situation where you're then hammering, the buyer for relief because of mistakes, made up front.
Okay, so allow me to jump to a couple of questions here. There's some good ones. So let's see, where do I start? There's a comment here, which is a good comment. Both sides need to be mature enough to say at the beginning of the deal that this is not for us. That's a really good point. I think where the communication gets tricky early on, even if everybody has good intentions, is if any service provider who's on third base for a deal is probably, and everybody's hungry for business these days, right? May not be too motivated to raise their hand and say, well, you know what, there might be an issue there, or you know what, before you sign the contract, let's spend another day or two kind of ironing this out. So there seems to be, I've seen in many scenarios, a rush just to get the deal done. Everybody wants to get it done, where you could argue that it could have justified more thought and analysis, and maybe one side, buy side or sell side, could have said, not for us. So I think that's great advice. Here's a question. I'm curious what you think, and Peter, I'll direct this to you initially. Do the external experts, if you will, the legal or the consulting firms, in your opinion, do they aid or hinder this process of defining responsibilities?
Well, a terrific question. I think they really have to be part of the whole project. Up front, they have to be clear. They have to be on board on what the whole project is about, clearly communicating this, and kind of even keeping both sides honest, because, as I mentioned before, sometimes, they're talking, but they're not listening. And I think in that scenario, these people could really help the project along, be part of the win situation here.
Okay. And John, what do you think? I mean, I've seen it both ways. I've seen situations where if, an advisor's involved, they're thinking holistically, and they're thinking long-term, it works out for everybody's advantage. On the contrary, if you have, one of the old school players in there that's just kind of hired by the buyer, beating the heck out of the vendor, with the focus on, cheap, best pricing, that tends to come around and haunt everybody. What do you think?
Well, the legal and facilitator advisor support. As Peter mentioned, you want their support, and you want to make sure they, as well as the specific buyer and seller, understand exactly what the what the requirements are, what the matrices are. No question about that. But I believe that as soon as you get past that and you get that understood, it's really between the provider and the client and the buyer directly. At the end of the day, the business decisions always outweigh the legal or the quote-unquote advisory role. So the sooner you can get to a face-to-face, if you will, between the actual person responsible for delivering the services and the actual person responsible for receiving the services, the better the entire engagement, will be put together, structured, and move forward.
Mm-hmm. Joe, any opinion on advisors and or attorneys helping or hindering the process?
In my experience, I mean, it's a mixed bag, in terms of the value-add proposition from both those groups. I'd say it's definitely been a more positive experience for me dealing with the advisors as opposed to external counsel, and it may be because of the firms I've had to interact with. And on major deals, it's hard to avoid that, but where you can, where a sourcing person or someone responsible for resource strategies can take ownership of the deal and make the call as far as the whole negotiation process, and do we really need to be spending hours and hours on a particular clause, that's generally a positive experience, in my past.
Yeah, just to weigh in on this one, with regard to responsibilities, I've seen in most scenarios, I've seen responsibilities fairly well spelled out through things like responsibility matrix and things like that. So I think there's less of a risk there. I think, though, with regard to the overall relationship, there's good and bad, consultants, or let's say good and better consultants, just like there's good and better providers. And I think the key is when you pick an advisor, just make sure that they're not focused, or as a client, you don't steer them to focus solely or mostly on negotiating your price, and you're thinking more long-term, holistically on the relationship. Because if the focus is tactical, you're going to suffer more holistically. Is that you, Vishal? Did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay.
I think, I heard the few last comments, and I think it's a all organization, different segments have to pitch in to make the process running. Offshoring, legal and compliance, risk, facilities, infrastructure people, IT, ops, everybody join hands. And some, because of the nature of the work, some of the processes take longer because you cannot compromise on the risk or the compliance attributes or the function you are trying to offshore and the access you are.
So Frank?
Yep, I think we lost him. Okay, I know Vishal's in the car heading to the airport, so he may float in and out. So just in the
if I
interest
can
of
make
time.
a comment
Yeah, please.
on the last point of that, it all boils down to the, what are we talking about here? It's the trust relationship, right? For any engagement, long-term and so forth, it's the trust. It's all about the trust relationship. So essentially, you certainly do need the help and support of your legal team, your advisory team, but at the end of the day, if you're going to do a handshake together and become partners, collaborative partners, buyer and seller, it's going to be founded on trust. So as I mentioned before, it ultimately comes back to the provider and to the customer.
Okay, fair enough. I know, Arlene, you're trying to keep me on track here. So let's see if we can flip to the next slide. Thank you. So what steps should be taken to get things back on track? So let's say you have challenges, and that's not unusual. Either and it could come from the buyer side, it could come from the provider side, where they're saying this thing is off track. Either you got off to a bad start, or maybe you're somewhere at the midpoint, halftime, if you will, of the contract, and either or both sides are happy. What steps should be taken to get things back on track? Peter, you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. What we have done in the past is we see things going off the rails here. We start our project meetings, maybe it was every 2 weeks or so. We make it weekly, and we find out what's going on and what deliverables are being done this week. So to follow the new project plan, let's put it that way, so this way people don't get swayed off track there. The other thing is I found that you have to have key personnel at these meetings to make decisions right then and there, not procrastinate and say we'll get back to it. If we're going off the tracks, we really got to know right now on how we get things back. And get the support of both sides on that. I find that really well. Open communications.
Okay, that's a good point. So, Joe, what do you think? You've had situations in the past, things get off track. What have you done? Is it just call a major sit-down? Do you bring a third party in? What have you typically done?
Well, yeah, typically you get back to, rebuilding the relationship. Obviously, it helps having a contract agreement that would have spelled out certain governance processes, but they're not always followed. And then, yeah, the trust might be there, and the supplier goes ahead and performs work, and then, boom, the internal client sees a bill for a few $100,000, $500,000. What's this? So it's actually an opportunity when things go off track to rebuild the relationship, get people back in communication. And yes, there is this process, and you really do need to. There's a reason why we established, a change control document for this particular project. So, and it also pulls back in a lot of the people who were involved originally. Where it could be an attorney. Hopefully, you never get to that point, but you bring back the people who owned it, from a sourcing and resourcing standpoint. Who should, on major projects, have some role on an ongoing basis. At the same time, the operations people are the ones that have to live with it.
Okay, super. Vishal, I think I hear a limousine. Is that you? Are you still on?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'll just put on mute. Yeah, I think I agree, but I think in cases where projects go a little bit off track, initially when you sign for large, small deals, you set the governance in place with the escalation mechanism and the change control and how to mitigate, any kind of eventuality. But I think still, problems occur and issues happen. I think in that two things which has played very well for me. How much value you think your vendor is provided, because sometimes it happens if there is a resource issue and it becomes a big issue, it's an escalation. How do you control that? So the most important segment, how do you define what the big or the small problem is? Defining a problem and then attacking it is more important than just making a noise over it. Okay, the system integrator, his 5 resources are, just resign, or there's a large attrition, or there was something. I think those things are do happen in larger relationships, one way or the other. But if you are mature enough to capitalize on your relationship and try to be transparent with both sides, because the roles what we play is very, very unique, because you have to have the internal strategy always in your head, as well as you have to have that symbiotic relationship with your system providers, so that you are towing the line to get the best quality of work from them.
Okay, that sounds fine. Thank you, Vishal. So, Arlene, can you flip to the next slide? Okay, so this is kind of push comes to shove, and I'm sure many on this call have been in this situation. Maybe some of you are there now. In fact, I know some of you are there now, where you're basically wondering if you should just, is it too tough to fix and time to move on? So I'll just ask this question to the two practitioners at the table here, at the virtual table with us. Joe, when, in your mind, in your opinion, when is it time to just kind of cut bait and find a new provider?
Well, yeah, it's fortunately those situations are kind of limited, and that's assuming you've gone through every process and looked at possible solutions. But sometimes it does reach a point where it's a performance issue, and the vendor cannot address it. So it's pretty much when you've looked at every other possible alternative before you, because no one really wants to do that, even if an internal client is particularly upset. I mean, wow, to transition on a major outsource, it's it's not an easy project. But sometimes I guess when it gets to a point, and hopefully you've got an agreement there in terms of transition support and all that good stuff. But I'd say when you've looked at all possible resolutions of the matter, and there's nothing else but to either bring the work back in-house or switch to another provider.
Okay. No, fine. Thank you. I have a question.
In other words, don't rush.
Don't rush it. Don't rush to do that, because it is tough, right, to surgically remove that provider from your organization, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Frank, as you know, John, Frank, as you know, we here at Blue Hill, coincidentally happen to be the recipients of, some customers finding a new provider. And the reason is, after all the things Vishal, Peter, and Joe outlined, your action plans, your communications, and, in terms of fixing it, I believe in the, part of that communications is trying to get back on track is face-to-face. I have a big issue with this. We're so dependent on the telephone, on email, and that's true. But you have to have face-to-face discussions to really nail down what the disconnect is when and if those kind of things happen. So essentially, as Joe just said, when there's no willingness to compromise, you tried all of these things, the action plans, everything failed, all measures are taken, and there's no willingness to compromise on either side. That's a time when the buyer has to seriously consider a change, whether it's in-house, which is rarely the case, once you're outsourced, or another provider.
Okay, so question here, John. I'd like to stay with you for a moment, because it pertains to something that's, I know, part of your DNA. So the question is really how can, realizing the importance of trust, how can more trust be built between the two organizations? So let's take it on the front end, right? So I agree that trust is important, but trust is something that's typically developed and earned over time. And knowing you as I do, John, for probably a dozen and a half years or so, I know you live by this. This is your personal DNA, and I know it's the DNA of Blue Hill. But how do you do it, right? You meet somebody 60 days ago, and here you are. You put a proposal together. How do they know that's just not a word in your marketing brochure? And how do they know it's real?
Well, that's you make a good point. It's a difficult thing to define up front. No question about it. But I think you have to look at any engagement at all. Is people worry about control, and we're very quick as data center outsourcers to say we are an extension of your data center. I mean, we're an extension of your data center. So basically, it's true. Yes, they are giving up some control. The corporate asset is the data, right? But we're an extension, and that's the way we look at our partnership. And we view all of our engagements and our customers as partners. But the trust relationship, how do you establish that, enough of it up front in order to do an engagement in the first place? One of the ways, besides the culture fit, is so important. I mean, just in collaborating together, negotiating, putting an engagement together, clarifying it, dealing with the people on both sides. I mean, we found differences in culture fits with some of our customers. Most of our customers, the culture fit is just there. It's so perfect. They see it, we see it. So that's a very important thing. That's more of a, I don't know whether you want to say emotional or a perceptual or psychological thing, but a customer feels that pretty quickly, and so does the provider. The other way for the buyer to get more confident on the trust relationship is references. When you're dealing with a provider that's 100% referenceable, like for example, we have 60+ customers, I think today. We don't give out references. We give them all our customers. Of course, we outline the profiles, the handful of profiles that closely best fit, the particular engagement, the particular buyer. And then we just tell them, call them. We don't even make appointments. So that
I'd like to reinforce that
found.
too.
Huh?
John, I'd like to reinforce
found that
point.
Yeah, go ahead.
That is positive.
Yeah, go ahead. Is that Peter?
I just want to reinforce that because you're quite right. That was on my sheet here too, is references. That means a lot, and it's just not just handing out a list and a contact. Similar projects, time they've been your customer, how long you've been working with these people. I think that really is the point to drive home here for references. Thank you.
Okay, super. So we're unfortunately, I had a couple other slides, and there's a few questions I didn't get to, but I do want to make sure we just allocate for a little bit on Blue Hill, you guys being kind enough to sponsor this and help support many things that we do. So, and I know it's one of the reasons why you're here. So, John, do you want to talk to this next slide or two?
Well, sure, yes. As I mentioned before, we are a Tier 2 or mid-tier infrastructure services provider. We're blessed to be in a Uptime Institute rated Tier 3, Tier 4 facility. Our core production facility is located in as close as you can be to Manhattan without being in Manhattan. We're on the Jersey-New York border on the Palisades. We provide dedicated disaster recovery solutions. We do not use the subscription services that have been commonly used in the past, but obviously we're providing fully managed services for our platforms, mainframe, iSeries, open systems, and all of those require disaster recovery services. So we do that in-house, and we found a way to provide dedicated facilities solutions so that customers have successful tests, where they have to come back again or whatever. We want their audit committee and so forth to to be satisfied that you're not limited to the number of hours and so forth. So that's one of the features, one of our differentiators. Our differentiators are flexibility both in contract and in solution. We don't force customers to convert to other products or systems that are necessarily so-called standardized. A lot of flexibility. And we help customers, yes, reduce their operating costs and minimize risk, by providing fully managed data center solutions. So, kind of in a nutshell, as I mentioned, we actually specialize in mainframe, and there's an awful lot of it out there. It always comes with something, and it comes with an AS400 or front end or what have you. But all operating systems, and you can't imagine how many even financial services companies still are running mission-critical systems under VSE or VM, as well as the OS, and also open systems. And we have. I'm told by IBM that we have more iSeries LPARs than any single data center facility in the Northeast. So we have something like 50 iSeries customers. LPARs as well.
Okay.
So that's kind of in a nutshell. Okay.
No, thank you, John, and I appreciate that. I think we have another slide, Arlene.
Yeah.
So, Peter, you want to walk us through quickly?
Yeah, I'll jump in quick. I know time. But basically, as I mentioned in my opening statement, about a year ago, we became sister companies with Blue Hill, and our claim to fame really is in the co-location environment here. Our footprint basically is from Manhattan to Boston. That's the majority of our customers that fall into that. And we do two things under the DR scenario. We both house data here, storage, etc. And we also have numerous workstation areas. And we were really shining during Irene and the Nor'easter. We had clients working here for at least 2 weeks when much of Connecticut was out of power, etc. We are also formerly as SAS 70, but now they call themselves SSAE. This is our 5th year in a row, and we're contracted out more. All our facilities here, we have 2 major data centers in Connecticut, and they're both N+1 with both UPSs and generators. It's typical data center with fire safety, etc. We have a number of carriers at our facility here to select both voice and data, and we go from either cabinets, cages, or even private suites. And managed services comes along with it also. We just recently just created another 3,400 square feet of data center space in one of our facilities here. And thank you for giving me the time today. That's it, Frank.
So to my panelists, thank you all for participating and taking the time. And certainly to Vishal and Joe, the practitioners, for volunteering to share your perspective. John, Peter, thank you for sponsoring and for the support for us and our members. As Arlene mentioned on the front end, this is being recorded, and so if you have a colleague that you want to listen to this presentation or discussion, or for any reason you want to kind of get through it again, it will be posted online, and Arlene will send you the link within 48 hours. There were a handful of questions and slides that I did not get to. Apologies for that, and I'll see to it that we get each of the questions answered post-webinar, because there were a couple of good questions and comments. Thank you all again. Thank you, Arlene, for producing this webinar, and hopefully we get to see you at the next virtual gathering or the next real gathering sometime soon. Thanks again.
All right, take care, Frank.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you. Bye-bye.